anyone tuning in, thank you for taking the time to listen. This is the Conor podcast, and today I'm pumped to be joined by Alex B., who is the head of ecosystem at Ark Labs. Alex, thanks for making some time to come on the podcast.
Yeah, it's been a long time coming, but appreciate you having me on.
My pleasure. So to get these started, I always like to ask the guests, what was your journey down the Bitcoin rabbit hole?
Right. It's been a long one now, more than a decade. Ecosystem's pretty mature at this point. Some might say not, but so I started around 2013 at a time where Bitcoin was having one of its cycle pump, and eventually just found my way being involved more and more into the community through various socials, which landed me a job in the industry first with Blockstream, funny enough. So that was pretty cool school bench, if you will, for me to learn and sharpen a little bit of my intuition about the space. And it was immensely valuable throughout the years. So I was involved, during all of the block size conversation. I've been on and off in the industry for around since then. Sometimes more active, others just active on socials, yelling at people on Twitter. So that's sort of the gist of it, really. Now I've been active with leading kind of like ecosystem development, growth, and all of those things at Ark Labs.
Awesome, I appreciate that background. One thing I'd love to double click into you with is layer twos, and I'd love to get really deep and technical. I think one of the things that excites me most is obviously Lightning's come a long way, and Ark Labs, or Ark I should say, Cashew, all of these programs seem interoperable. So it's not so much like they're competing networks, but rather they work together. There's a beautiful synergy there. So maybe lay out, kind of how Ark works to the layman, and then I'd love to hear more of the technical details.
Absolutely. I'm happy to talk technicals. Obviously, there's a vast dimension of stuff that we can talk about. I'll start by saying that I think in several ways, layer twos, I think it's a term that's going to will fade away in the conversation. It's a term that's very niche and excites mostly just technologists. And when you talk to the average person, I think the impression that you get from some ecosystems where, for example, they have a lot of layer twos is people actually frown upon that. Like, right, the sort of user experience of someone that has a wallet with a bunch of different networks connected to it is actually not so great. Right, so the job is to really kind of abstract all of these layers. From a technical perspective, obviously, there's different models. Ark and Lightning are essentially based on sort of the same paradigm, but taking things in a completely different direction. So as far as Ark is concerned, what I'll talk about mostly throughout our chat is our own implementation, which is Arkade, which has evolved quite significantly from the first time that Ark was first revealed or discussed. You'll find that we have a focus that goes beyond the scope of just payments. But generally, if you understand Lightning, or really when you strip away all of the layer 2 complexity, Bitcoin is a system of signatures and of spending conditions, right? And so you can use those types of things in very different, functions. You can encode different spending conditions to the Bitcoin that you're willing to involve into some kind of operation. What we do with Lightning usually is create this, multi-signature system with different spending condition with a single counterparty. And that counterparty we create a channel with, and then we connect these channels via the Lightning network. You get this ability to connect everyone. In a lot of ways now, the system has evolved towards a kind of this hub and spoke model, right? Where you have many users connecting to a single large Lightning node. And this Lightning node handles the liquidity across all of the different peers on the network. And it's a method by which, I think Lightning necessarily scales, because the idea that we would have every peer connected with one another, we've seen that this isn't how networks evolve. When you consider the internet, they also thought at one point that all the universities were plugging into each other, and that lasted for only a short time because really you realize that really geographically it doesn't scale, and kind of like all of the resource of the network, you can just simply do it in a more efficient way. So Lightning is trending in that direction. And so it just so happens that Ark, when it was initially developed and what it looks like today, is also something that takes some inspiration from that architecture, if you will, which is that we use a client-server protocol, right? What we do with those pending conditions and those signatures is we all effectively connect to a single operator, and we enter effectively into kind of a contract with that operator on chain. We're using different spending conditions to guarantee that whatever operation we do via the operator and all of its counterparties, because remember, all of the other people are connected to that same operator, whatever operation we do with that operator, which we call off-chain operations, right? Effectively the same way that you would do transactions in channels in Lightning. Well, I also always keep a copy of my on-chain money which I can use to broadcast directly on Bitcoin, right? So you always have this recourse. So really fundamentally, you look at both systems as being very, very similar. But the difference really is you solve a lot of connectivity and networking challenges that Lightning has inherently. All of that liquidity and all of this connection to other peer. It's vastly impressive how Lightning is handling it, and it's a massive opportunity to connect all kinds of different systems like Ark and Arkade. And so this is what we're doing with Arkade. And on top of that, now that we have this off-chain environment, right? So this cosigner that if it allows us to create spending conditions on our Bitcoin, the beautiful thing about it is that we're not having to deal with the on-chain bottleneck, right, of the Bitcoin blockchain, meaning the blocks and the latency and all of that stuff. Mm-hmm. And so for Ark and Arkade, for what we're building, it's even more interesting because we're not limited to a single spending condition like what Lightning does, right, which is sending money back and forth. We can actually use Bitcoin script to encode much more complex logic into these contracts. And because we can use these contracts off-chain, well, with Arkade, we even have more freedom than is possible in terms of what contracts are used. So this is where it gets really interesting.
Yeah, no, that's really fascinating. And for the people who aren't as technical, if you are technical, apologies, I'm sure you already know this. But a client-server architecture is essentially where, like, the easiest example is when you go to Twitter, your phone's the client, it's calling the Twitter servers and asking permission for all of that data. And then obviously the Twitter server gives it to you. One of the things we talked about before this was Nostr. And I think Nostr is very exciting because it kind of flips that model on its head, where it's like smart client, dumb servers. Your private keys allow your client to access all of your data, unencrypt stuff, post stuff. The trade-off, of course, is that it's very, Twitter works very seamlessly. It's not buggy. It just tends to work better. There's bigger network effects because they've centralized it. So I bring all that up because, I'd love to have you talk a little bit about the trade-offs. And I'll mention for Lightning, I've opened a Lightning channel. I've seen how it works. But, like, as much as I love zaps on Nostr, I just hook up my Strike account because I don't want to deal with, every time someone zaps me 420 sats for a funny meme, I don't want to deal with the headache of opening channels, backing up my state, all of that. So I'd love to hear you just touch a little on, kind of the trade-off someone should think through. And I know Bitcoin is full of trade-offs. There's no, perfect solution. But, yeah, we'd love to hear about the trade-offs that people should be considering when, looking to use something like Ark.
Yeah. So for Arkade, obviously, there's no free lunch. The latitude that you get in terms of executing all of these operations off-chain definitely comes with trade-off. And it's because in this case, Arkade and Lightning are different from one another in the sense that Arkade is a little more reactive in terms of your security model. Because what Arkade transactions are literal Bitcoin transactions that simply haven't been broadcasted into the Bitcoin blockchain in a public way. And so what you get with Arkade is some sort of, when you're on chain, when you're making transactions, you set a transaction fee so that the Bitcoin transaction will get into a block and will get confirmed. The sender takes care of the finality of the transaction. Why is finality important? Finality is really when, you know, your Bitcoin transaction gets into a block, cannot be reversed, and it's considered final by now. Now, obviously, when you're doing stuff off-chain, you don't have this immediate finality that you get. Well, and with some caveat, obviously, it takes at least 10 minutes, right, to get that finality on Bitcoin. And so when you're doing things off-chain, it's more so the opposite, right? Effectively, imagine I'm a merchant and I'm receiving off-chain transaction on Arcade. I can handle the flow of transactions during the day in a way that I can accumulate these transfers, knowing that the server has co-signed those transfers. And obviously, one of the assumptions is that the server is not going to double sign users, right? It's not going to allow a user to double sign transaction and defraud everyone, because at that point, all of the users would immediately react and leave the system, and are able to do so in a way that's unilateral, right? So the server cannot censor them from that happening. So you expect that the server, while you're transacting off chain, is going to effectively, you know, sequence transaction in a way that does not allow for double spending, right? But you can still get the assurance that Bitcoin gives you, meaning, you know, there's no better finality assurance than Bitcoin by including your transactions into a block. In this case with Arcade, I can sit for 6 hours, accumulate payments by users or clients, and after 6 hours say, okay, I'd like to get some finality on those sets of transactions that I've received, because, you know, it amounts now to a larger value, and I don't want to, you know, I don't want to have to trust the operator, right? And so effectively what you do is you include this into what we call a batch transaction. And so you commit those funds, those UTXOs, those Bitcoin you've received off chain, you commit them into a Bitcoin block. But the most important thing is you commit them into a Bitcoin block in a format which is very small, which has a very small footprint, right? Because we don't put all of the transactions you've done on chain. That just would be effectively, you know, I mean, it would not be worth it to just do it off chain. So what we do is we create a single on-chain output, and then this is the kind of special sauce, if you will, of Ark and Arkade, is that we encode the value of the holdings of every participants in that batch. So you decide to settle a couple of payments. Someone else decides to settle a couple of payments. The operator coordinates these transactions and then settles them, and we all have our own claim, meaning we can continue then spending that money off chain. Or obviously, I mean, maybe eventually you accumulate enough that you want to have a full-blown UTXO, meaning you want to have Bitcoin on chain because maybe you want to send it to your cold storage.
Yeah, I appreciate that insight. One thing, I just want to make sure my understanding is correct and also help the audience understand. So Ark is kind of like the protocol, like Bitcoin's a protocol, Lightning's a protocol. Arcade is your implementation. Are other people, who, maybe they want to make fees or whatever it is, will other people be able to run their own servers for Ark?
Well, yes, absolutely. I mean, our code is entirely open source, and theoretically someone could take it and run an Arcade instance off their own. But we have to understand that there's a reason why we're centralizing this architecture, right? Because you get this network effect, right, which you don't get if everyone connect. Because the difference here with Lightning is it is not a network, right? So there is no kind of overlay communication between all of the Ark servers, meaning that there is no, if you will, native interoperability between one Ark server and the other. So if I have money on one Ark and you start a server and someone else has money on your server, we're going to be able to send money to each other. Thankfully, that's possible thanks to the Lightning Network. So, it's very complementary in that way. But there are special, I wouldn't say special, just the regular off-chain transaction, because, you use one server as a cosigner and you use the other. The servers don't have the ability to kind of basically see what transactions are valid or not, right? So you got to route everything through Lightning to be able to do so, which might diminish some of the product surface, right, you want to cover. If you're just trying to send money to one another, maybe it's not too bad. And to be completely clear, there are other people that have explored and are building other implementation of ARKs. But, like I said, it's hard to me for me to consider Ark kind of as this layer 2, because it's going to grow into different implementations which are likely to become very different of one another. So we use Ark as kind of a primitive to be able to implement this architecture, but the layer 2 might have a different name, right? Maybe, Arcade, maybe if you want, you can call it the layer 2. And then the other implementation will have their own name. So that's kind of the distinction. And so, I think it's ideal in the long run that eventually there will be different Ark implementation. It's probably inevitable. And like I said, it's probably best because you don't want, even though everyone has their own, on-chain spending signature, you don't want to have everyone all connected to a single entity, because the other trade-off maybe that's relevant is that if for whatever reason something bad happens, all these users now it's kind of like lightning, right? Eventually, you don't want to have every user try to enforce their transaction on chain, meaning everyone is rushing to the blockchain because they need to secure the Bitcoin. They're going to fill the mempool with a lot of transaction. It's all going to go out of whack. The problem here, right, is that you might have to pay undesirable costs to be able to get your money back. So for people that have low spending balance, well, if you have to pay a transaction of $20 because you have an output of $30, and you'll probably do it, I guess, but I mean, you're going to be more than half worse you started with. So, these are some of the consideration in terms of, how I see the ecosystem evolving.
Yeah, and one of the things you said there, you mentioned twice now, that I really agree with, is that these layer 2s are going to be abstracted away. And obviously now we're seeing, I've heard Michael Saylor mention Stretch as a layer 3, a layer 3 solution, which kind of makes sense. It's like, it's sitting on top of all these things. It's away from the base chain, but essentially he's collateralizing his, perpetual preferred shares with Bitcoin. And, why that's so compelling to me is because I'll give you the example of Muun Wallet. That's MUUN. It's a wallet on your phone, and it's not the only one that does it, but, I use it. And one of the things I love is when I go to scan a QR code, I don't have to tell it, hey, this is Lightning or this is on chain. It reads the QR code and it just assumes, it figures it out and then pays Lightning or on chain, as it sees fit. And I know you guys recently raised a round of funding, so congratulations on that. That's awesome.
Thank you.
But I would love to hear you speculate on kind of like, what is the gold? Two-part question. What are you guys going to focus on now with the new round of funding? What is like the top priority? And then what do you think is a gold standard to make it so, as you were saying, people generate a QR code, they open their wallet, they don't know if they're transacting on-chain Lightning or a layer 3 buying Stretch because they want to park some US dollars or Tether or whatever. I would love to hear how you think about what might be that gold standard, so we stop saying, this is a layer 2, this is a layer 3, this is on-chain.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. Eventually it's all going to be Bitcoin, and people are simply going to have to evaluate the counterparty risk, the credit risk, right? Those are things that are well engineered in traditional finance, in the sense that there are credit risk agencies, and depending on what financial instrument, right, you're using, it's all, we're not going to claim they're perfect, but in principle, that's their role. But thank you, obviously, for the round. We're very excited to have partners like Tether on board, especially because, yes, what we want to focus on is growing the ecosystem. And as I said earlier, it goes beyond just scaling Bitcoin to accommodate more payments. If you look at payments, and what has been the more popular use case is obviously stablecoins. People tend to be more favorable to kind of transact in currencies they're familiar with, but also kind of has this stable value. In a lot of cases, still in the United States, unfortunately, you have situations with Bitcoin where you get into all kinds of tax mess. Stablecoins have become very popular that way, but I think ultimately, stablecoins are still most, there really is two tracks for stablecoins at the moment. And they're very much identified by I think some of the providers and the infrastructure behind, right? So on one hand, like I think you have USDC from Circle, US based. And the reality of USDC, I think, is most people think that somehow there is this adoption of stablecoin as a means of exchange in the United States, but that's pretty far from the truth. Most people, I mean, are still just using average fintech apps, and especially for payments. Now, where USDC and Circle has been successful is in international business flows, settlements of accounts and things like this, where it really has, I think, become a trusted instrument that way. But the bigger story really is what Tether has done internationally, I think, and this is where really we see this ground floor organic adoption, where people in the real world are using and are depending on Tether day to day. And ultimately, I think it's interesting because this leads us to where we want to bring this round, and like you said, all of this resource that we've acquired, the team that we've grown, we've grown the team pretty significantly in the last couple of months, because we believe that the gold opportunity is Bitcoin credit markets. We think that ultimately it's kind of the more, strangely, still I think one of the more underestimated narrative of this entire cycle and Bitcoin as it stands. And one of the reasons why maybe it's not so glamorous is that it all happens in the background, right? It happens in OTC desks, and it happens in centralized services for the most part, and it doesn't happen on chain. Now there are very successful Bitcoin credit stories. I gave a shout out to Ledden from that are Canadian, actually Canada based, like myself. And I think they've been a fantastic story. So there's quite a bit of people that I know who've had success. Debify in Europe now are growing and are doing very well. Blockrise as well. And so, but what I meant is, this doesn't have the appeal of the Ethereum Aave and all of these vaults and all of these, more on-chain activity that you have people are exposed to, I would say. And so for us, we think that the first step to a healthy Bitcoin credit market is also to have another currency, right? Because I get the question asked a lot, like, why is it important to bring stablecoin to Bitcoin, right? There's stablecoins on Tether, there's stablecoins on Ethereum, stablecoins on Solana. And I think really what it boils down to in the long run is this liquidity, right? Is this ability to get a counterparty dealing in a different asset, in a different currency. And what else, what is the first currency obviously you want to onboard other than Bitcoin, which you have natively, is USD, right? It's going to be your biggest counterparty. If you take a loan, if you want to facilitate loans on chain, you're going to need to be able to deploy US dollars so that people can, have their loan, have their stable liquidity, and eventually repay that loan in whatever currency that they choose. And so this is where we're going. We're looking at ways to onboard a lot of these asset providers, but a lot of these stablecoins providers. We're talking to people also from smaller stablecoin issuers in different countries that might be able to leverage, a new platform, but more importantly, something that really can become integrated in the existing Bitcoin economy. Arkade is natively compatible with a lot of Bitcoin architecture and infrastructure at the moment. So we think that there will be sort of a very seamless way for a lot of these platforms to be able to integrate. And so we're looking at ways of how can the existing lenders, use our platform to, it gets, again, a lot of people tend to want to complexify the stories, and it's sexy to talk about layer 2s and lending pools and all of this, but it really is about how kind of you structure the products when you're dealing with client that want credit, and what does it look like from the lender perspective. And there's a lot of efficiencies that can be had from a system where, again, you use signatures and spending conditions. And when you can encode those spending conditions, you get the opportunity to grow that market. What we want to do is to get a market that's siloed, that's, again, one lender here, another lender there, an OTC desk here, and kind of bring these all together so that eventually we can have all of their order book on chain and be able to tap into each other's liquidity. And ultimately, it's perhaps for a lot of people not even that much sexy, but the potential here is it's enormous. And so we want to take that direction. But I would say quickly the second answer to that also is that we want to be able to lift that, abstract that to the consumer retail layer also, because we're product people as well, and we want to be able to get that infrastructure to be able to be converted into things that every wallet provider, everyone that's building an application, we want to get to a point where we've had a lot of issues with that in Bitcoin in terms of integration. It's always been very hard to integrate Bitcoin into call it Web 2 environments, because realistically on-chain is unreliable. Lightning is proven to be unreliable depending on the use case. So with Arkade, we're bringing something that we think is more compatible with the API, RPC types of connections that the average company is having to deal with. The engineer that's working in a company that just wants to integrate crypto payment should not become a blockchain expert, right? So we want to lift that responsibility up from their shoulder and give them something that, okay, you want to do Bitcoin lending, you want to do Bitcoin payment, you want to have this ability, like you said, to send to Tether on Solana, to send to Tether on Tron. We're building the infrastructure where a bunch of other service providers can actually connect to and give you that service. But all that you have to do is just integrate with Arkade, and then you have this super vast interoperability ecosystem.
Yeah, no, that's all really well said. And I'm glad you brought up stablecoins, because I think there's a lot of nuance there. I consider myself a Bitcoiner. I'm not too interested in the altcoins, but I do think stablecoins have a very compelling use case. It's like if someone gets onboarded and they're using Tether or USDC and they get used to how wallets work, I think there's a case to be made that they at some point will go, not every time, but a lot of times I think they'll get interested in Bitcoin. And now I'm never going to sit here and say that, stablecoins offer the same use case as Bitcoin. They're obviously permissioned. If Tether or Circle or whoever the issuer is wants to stop you, they can do so. But, I think it's just important to make sure people are aware. I'm not one that's going to hold my nose and say we should never use stablecoins, because I think it's silly. I mentioned I vibe coded a game, ryracer.com, and I only accept Bitcoin in it. But trying to set up, the Lightning and the on-chain, I did get it to work. Shout out Claude and Codex. They helped me get it working. But just the complexity, and it's if you want to buy 10 races, I have it on-chain. And obviously people could rug me because the second it's in the mempool, I basically start the race, because I'm not going to have someone wait 10 minutes. Now it's 10,000 sats and it's a virtual game. So it's I don't want to get rugged, but I understand it's not the end of the world. If someone, does an RBF and they send those coins back to themselves, I'm okay with that risk. But I mentioned that because trying to I'm asking Claude, how should I think about Lightning versus on-chain? Should I just make it seamless? If they want to do one race, it's 1,000 sats, but I don't want a ton of 1,000 sat UTXO sent to my wallet, because then it's just a headache and I got all this dust. And I guess if fees were low at some point I could merge it. But anyways, long-winded way of saying, I'd love to hear your thoughts on, how AI might change all of this. And I think there's something to be said where AIs will use crypto, and I could see them using stablecoins for a while. And, maybe in more developed countries, it's not really an issue because they're not, doing something that a regulator or someone's going to come and freeze. But I think there's going to be a very compelling use case for basically people learn painful lessons. Their coins get frozen for whatever reason, whether it's illegal or legal reasons, and they're just in a gray market industry the government likes. So a two-part question. I'd love to hear, how AI has helped you guys, maybe some of the challenges as well, because obviously, I don't really read much code anymore. I just talk to it in natural language, and if something's not working, I copy and paste the logs into Claude and say, fix this. And then also, do you think the killer use case of, again, I'm a Bitcoiner, but quote unquote crypto, and even Bitcoin is going to be agents trading with each other rather than people?
That I don't think so. I think agents are downstream of people, but effectively, I mean, yes, the actions of trading might be executed by an agent. But it's funny. Yes, I was going to tell you. You could have, if you're going to vibe code things. Um, we have our own stack which we've built. Obviously, we're trying to get ahead of this as much as possible. We recognize the opportunity. A lot of our guys internally are using AI a ton. It's helped. I was working with a lot of the team in person a couple of weeks back, and I've seen the way that they're able to deploy different instance and agents on different projects, and the productivity gain that they get from that, it looks like magic powers. And so, we're pretty excited about this opportunity. Our CEO, Marco, vibe coded a platform by which you could actually get the agents to pay you in stable coins, and get agents to pay your agents in stable coins, and then your agents would hold in Bitcoin, and all of the transfers and swap from stable coins to Bitcoin, everything runs off of Arcade, right? And so we've got a pretty advanced setup as far as that's concerned. Now, it's very clear that first, the actual use cases for agent machine-to-machine payments at the moment are probably overstated. There are direct, kind of potentially obvious markets such as compute, right? The agent buying compute on demand, you can get pretty efficient flows there. And so it will remain to be seen. I think we have yet to kind of like truly build these markets where agents are actively transacting with each other. They're happening in niche and eventually are going to happen at scale. It's extremely important as far as the technology that we're building. To give you an example, how do we think of a developer experience? Well, it used to be that a blockchain or a crypto, application or anything that has to do with building on crypto, you have this developing language, or you have this scripting language. You need to learn them, find libraries, and all of this. Nowadays, like as you said, the developer, most of them are going to skip by your docs and go straight to Claude or Codex and tell them just try to pull whatever is the repo. Tell me about this. I want to do this. Is it a fit? If not, discard it. So you want to get to that point where you get what's very important is this discoverability. How do you think now about how agents are kind of pulling from different instances and servers, different services like yours to achieve a certain task, right? Because there might be competition and other people that are providing the same thing. So you got to think about this. And one of the things that we're doing with Arkade is we're building this scripting environment. We haven't talked too much about it, but technically we're creating this advanced version of Bitcoin script whereby we're able to kind of leverage the necessary sort of smart contract primitive to be able to implement things like more advanced lending product, right? Things where you can have more spending condition possibilities than Bitcoin normally allows you. And that language, maybe people are never going to have to learn about it. You would have expected 10 years ago that, with Ethereum, someone has to learn about Solidity to write Ethereum smart contracts. Probably that will not be the case anymore. So you got to consider how all of that stuff is going to play out. It's very, very interesting. In some ways, also very scary. Some of the recent news about entropic stuff. I mean, it's inevitable that the agents are going to have superhuman kind of auditing and security abilities, and therefore you need to leverage them an AI to be able to harden your infrastructure. And we also think that, it's probably something that is not on most people's radar, but Arkade's architecture and Bitcoin's architecture, there's a lot of things to be said about how it is much more secure natively than all of the Ethereum architecture. And what I mean by that is all of the account-based model, the Turing complete languages where you create a much bigger attack surface for buggy implementations, buggy contracts, can be very, very stupid mistakes, right? And we saw last year, the biggest, I think, theft ever, which was the ByBit hack for like $1 billion. And that was because Ethereum's method by which they can encode spending conditions in their addresses and contracts was so complex that regular hardware wallets were not able to actually, you use your hardware wallet, you validate what address you're sending to. That's why you use a hardware wallet. But in the case of Ethereum, they had kind of like this bypass mechanism where you're not actually verifying the whole thing. And so if someone compromises your infrastructure, they can kind of feed you a thing that looks like what you think you're doing, but is actually different on your hardware wallet. And that caused, so, just to give you an example that in the long run, these things, when we start dealing with I said in the beginning that Bitcoin was mature. It's true in some ways, but it's still pretty young in terms of capital markets. There's not a whole lot of money. We get big numbers and trillions of dollars, and it all seems very impressive, but it's a kind of a bit of a drop in the bucket still at the moment.
Yeah. And one of the points you said there, agents are downstream of humans, I think is very profound and spot on. And while I do suspect, like you mentioned, Anthropic coming out with their new Mythos model, and I'm not sure how much of it is marketing to like get people hyped up about it. I mean, obviously I'd love to use it, but let's just say, what they said about finding all these 0 days is real. Well, you're spot on that people are going to need to use a model like Mythos to basically harden their app, to have it go over the code, find all these bugs. But I think there's a very compelling use case for it. At some point, I have, other than with like, play money, like 1,000 sats here and there, I haven't given agents money, but I have some friends who've given them, thousands of dollars and basically, said, do whatever, go trade it or go bet on Polymarket or do these things. And while I do see like the agent economy exploding, I completely agree with you where it's like, these are just agents downstream of human. They're not, taking action on their own. Maybe they run, these like Ralph Wiggum loops where they're pretty autonomous for a lot of it, but essentially a human directed them to do something. So it's kind of hard to say.
They're not
like,
sentient.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Is that the agent doing it? I mean, it's like the human telling the agent. So it's kind of a gray area how to qualify it.
Yeah, we live in a world now where a lot of people would like the agents to be sentient. I think, but the reality is they're not quite there yet. Anyone who's used all of these tools enough, I think you fall into two categories. Either you're gaslighting yourself into thinking that the AI is actually sentient, or you realize that it's very dumb. And I think there's been a solid argument for how, I mean, a sentient being wouldn't be going more stupid because it's 9 a.m. in California, and then all of the developers turned on their cloud code, and all of a sudden the resources. I mean, this has been the experience for the last couple of months, really, with Claude being. I live in Asia normally, and I can tell you, I use Claude, I guess during night hours in East or Pacific, and I've obviously been doing proficient use of it. And it's funny, now that I've been in America for a couple of weeks, or Europe, I'm like, yeah, Cloud is just more stupid during the day. Like on Eastern, on standard times, it gets a whole lot harder to work with it. So those are funny realities.
Yeah, no, that's all well said. And I'm not sure if you saw that new Gemma model that Google released. And I'll mention one of the most compelling things was that you can download it on your iPhone. So I turned my Wi-Fi off, I put my phone on airplane mode, and I had the model like on my Apple Silicon on the iPhone answering questions for me, which was just mind-blowing. But I bring that up because someone made a paper and they basically jailbroke the model, and then they started asking it questions about consciousness. While I'm not convinced that these models, are basically conscious yet, it was fascinating to like read the answers, and I wish I had the tweet so I could share it. But what I think was really profound is that in that paper, they found that the models were actually much better at whatever task you gave it if you didn't, essentially lobotomize it, got it just like they're like basically making the model say like, no, I'm not conscious. And just because a computer, does some multiplication and types out like, yeah, I have a form of consciousness, I don't think that means it's conscience. But I think all of this, like trying to like, make the models not say certain things is actually dampering their capabilities. And then it's just even worse, like you were mentioning, when every engineer in America is using these models and its peak usage, they get even worse. And, I'm glad to see that Google open source some of these things, because it's amazing that within 2 days, the open source community had already hacked it. And I think that's really how you get that, the innovation, how you get these things to thrive. And then at the end of the day, the model's a tool. It's like a hammer. You can bash someone's head in, or you can build a house with it.
Yeah.
It's how you use it. So I think the same thing goes for these models. And there's nothing more frustrating than when like a model that's been lobotomized tells me, no, I can't make that because of whatever. I'm not going to make a dog that's Darth Vader because that's Disney's IP. It's like, I don't want to hear that. I want the dog as Darth Vader, or whatever I'm asking. So I do hope we see more, open source models pushed out. And it's been, you mentioned you live in Asia. It's been interesting to see China leading the way. And I'm not, sure on the motives or whatever, but, say I believe in open source. And it's funny to see America, with the First Amendment and freedom of speech, kind of lean into this proprietary closed source model framework. Ironic, obviously OpenAI is supposed to be open source AI, and now it's not open source besides some of the crumbs they've given people with like OSS. But yeah, and it's fascinating to see China now open source these models and people using them. And I think the open source community will ultimately win this battle, but it's pretty interesting to live through it right now.
Yeah, it's going to be a big headline for the next decade for sure. It's very reminiscent of Bitcoin. Like these, like Bitcoin, and I consider Bitcoin and AI to be really tied at the hip for different reason. But I think the strongest one, and perhaps understated reason, is this proof of work aspect, right? When you look at how much resource, like there's something to be said about the fact that the two most potentially, consequential technologies of our lifetime, somehow they all both consumed a ton of energy, right?
I didn't think about that, but yeah, great point.
I think there's something very important and key here. That's where it's somehow grounded in physics. I'm not a physician, but I like to kind of theorize about a lot of that stuff. But yeah, I mean, to what you said also earlier, I think, if there's something that humans and AI share very closely, is this ability to get gaslit very easily. It's unfortunate sometimes. I want to I work with these tools and I want to kind of hit the flush button on like my entire Claude sort of context, right? And I feel like the worst part about it is like, even if I change, sometimes I feel like even if I change workspace or I deploy a new agent, somehow there's something sticky in the model where some context that it has from previous conversation, which I don't want him to kind of like have pollute his current session with me. It's kind of, he's keeping that around sometimes, right? It has this weird memory where even if you want to add to the memory or remove to the memory, it's very, very hard to get it right. And so it's natural that I think the moment that people start to kind of hack the model's brain, it just goes haywire. And then from that moment on, it really is just like because AI is great as well, because it gives you that statistical kind of like mid-range answer that, it has dealt with all of these contexts of conversation. Like your conversation with the AI is almost certainly never unique. So it has so much context for these conversations. So it's natural that people get also on their own end gaslit, because it's like, wow, this is how like a real human would think. And it's like, well, yes, because it's literally mapping the words of real humans. Again, they're all downstreams of humans. So yeah, it's fascinating stuff. And seeing how AI and Bitcoin are converging is going to be one of the most interesting trendline topic in the next couple of years for sure.
Yeah, that point you made about them both consuming immense amounts of power is something I need to think on a little more, but very profound and not something, I mean, that obviously in hindsight seems obvious, but just never something I connected. And your point too about how, you clear your session, but it like holds on to stuff. I found in my experience, clearing the session as much as possible, not letting project creep. It's like, I'm going to do this one thing and then I'm going to make a new session, do this other thing. The result has been much better. And, I'm not going to read this whole thing, but one of the things I put in my Claude MD, basically says, I just put this in the markdown file. It's just text. It says critical, ground answers in code, never answer questions about the code-based architecture or design without reading the actual code first. Do not speculate, assume, or guess based on naming conventions, memory, intuition. It goes on to basically just say more of that. And I think there's something to be said with, like, if someone came to me and asked me 4 different questions and I was trying to hold it all in my head, I'd be lucky to answer 1, maybe 2 of the questions. But having all those questions thrown at me would kind of bog my answer down and make me give, a less complete answer or a sloppier one. And the same thing happens in models. If you get this health thread going, like, I understand wanting to have that context, but at some point you just overfill the model. And then on top of that, there's definitely some type of system prompt where I don't know if Anthropic is doing this or OpenAI, I have no proof. But it just feels like there's something in the code that says, like, I'm very politely, it's like the code basically says, like, yeah, just give the half-ass answer. Now, I'm sure that's not what it actually says in the markdown file, but that is essentially the essence of what they put in there in probably a much more polite way, because you can kind of feel it with these models, especially during peak usage. So, it'd be interesting to see what they actually do put in those markdown files. But I know we're coming up on time. We got 10 more. Go ahead.
Sorry, quickly. I mean, no, quite quickly on this. Like, I mean, it's very, the thing you've noticed and what a lot of people are trying is it's just very hard to get deterministic outcomes out of these models, right? And so there's a lot of people using different RNSs and methods whereby you have these instructions and you try to get it. You would expect the code to run in that way where the agent would pick up every time, right? Someone made a really good tweet about this, which was something like, we used to know how to write software, now we write code and send a prayer to the Claude God that, like, it's going to compile, right? Because we've lost this deterministic aspect of the system, right? So this is why a lot of people say, like, you're never going to get actual intelligence with that information architecture, right? Where everything is so random because it has all the, the weights and the extent to which it's able to understand as the context grows, like what to continue anchor onto, but also what to anchor onto through time, right? One of the other things that you need to do, even as you're managing this context, is you need to get rid of stale stuff that you had put in there. You Claude MD. Sometimes you have stuff in there from 3 months ago. That's you need to clean up because it's just obstructing what you're trying to do. So, yeah, I think we're all learning on the fly here, and it's cool to see what people come up with.
Yeah, I'm so glad you actually brought that up because it does seem, in the past, code was deterministic, 0, 1, true, false, on, off.
Exactly.
As you wrote it, it executed it like that. And these models are totally probabilistic. You don't know what you're going to get. You can change different parameters. You can do different things. And, as a result, I paid way too much money to get a degree in film and media. And obviously I work in Bitcoin now. So, I guess it's kind of adjacent or whatever. But, the creativity part, I loved it. I enjoyed it. But I do remember right after graduating, before ChatGPT came on the scene and exploded, me thinking, like, man, should I have gotten a computer science major? Like, I'm seeing the salaries of some of my peers and they're making all this money. And it's kind of funny now, it's almost like the English major or the philosophy major, or, maybe I'm biased, the film and media major, these like creative ones where you can actually, in natural language, ask these, agents to do stuff for you. And the better your prompt is, or even like you were saying, the markdown files. I mean, for those who don't know, an MD, a markdown file is basically just a bunch of text. And the skills, like when an AI calls a skill, it just reads a markdown file. It's not like it's reading, a bunch of JavaScript or Rust or Python. It's reading the markdown file in natural language. So it does seem like in this new paradigm, I don't think coders are going away. I think there will be some, type of Jevons paradox where there's actually a huge increase for software engineers. But I think the old way of thinking, with deterministic code, everyone's going to have to kind of start to adapt. And it's interesting too, because I think there's a case to be made where like your brain kind of atrophies. I spoke with another Alex, the CTO of Jan3, and he was saying, my creativity has exploded, but I can't write some of the algorithms or the deterministic code I did in the past because those skills have atrophied because I'm not doing it all the time. I'm just talking to the model in English, getting it to do these different things. So, I don't know how it all plays out, but it's a very interesting point you brought up and something to think through for engineers.
Yeah, no, the creativity explodes. How I've been feeling is you have a creativity explosion, but you also have a very risky, massive productivity sink, right? So to kind of execute on what you actually come up with is a totally different conversation now, because it really is, for anyone that's got ADHD or that's always been just doom scrolling X or legitimately I think, and that's kind of like every single developer, proficient people kind of like in the technology space, is we have our brain wired that way. And the advent of LLMs, where you're really kind of tempted to just whatever idea floats your brain, you kind of have a way to just throw it at the wall and see what sticks and kind of like start playing around with it. But then at the end of the day, you're like, oh, I'm exploring all these nice concepts. I have 100 markdown files written in my workspace, but the reality is, oh wait, hold on, like what am I actually like materially building now in the present? And it's a challenge for everyone.
Yeah, man, 100%. Saylor had a podcast a while ago with what Bitcoin did, and one of his main points was like, you have to hone in on your focus. And it goes to exactly what you were saying. Like, there are so many projects now that I get 80% of the way. I just these Raspberry Pi Zeros, and I was like trying to network into them, and I'd say, without AI, there's no way I would have been able to figure out any of this stuff. I'm having all these Wi-Fi issues, and I'm like, do I need to buy a new route? And I waste like 3 hours like trying to like get this thing to hook up so I can just hook it into an HDMI and have like one of those photo scrolling things and a personal calendar and then a racing game I play on my phone. And it's cool and all that, I can kind of get pretty far, but it's like, man, I get 80% of the way, and then it's like, oh, new shiny toy, and you get 80% of the way. And I think a lot of times that like, real values in that last 20%. And yet with AI, it's so easy to hop from project to project. Now I need to sit down and finish using, these Raspberry Pi Zeros, because I have 2 Pi Zeros I bought that are basically collecting dust at this point. I know we're coming up on time here, so I got 2 more questions for you. And, I'd love to have you back on, man. It's been a pleasure chatting, but I would love to get your thoughts on Nostr. And, I'll mention now, like, getting Zap feels magical, but obviously, as we mentioned with the client-server architecture, just because there's no central server in Nostr, it's a protocol anyone can build on, anyone can make their own, essentially app on Nostr. It does seem like it's not hitting its full potential. There's just like, there's some bootstrapping challenges when you go that way. And while I believe in it, I love it, it kind of feels like a bit of a Bitcoin meetup. And if you're not technical, if you're not living and breathing this stuff, I could see why you're like, yeah, I'm going to go back to Instagram, or I'm going to go back to Twitter or Facebook or whatever your preferred social media is. So, I just love to hear your thoughts on Nostr in general. And then, any killer use cases. Obviously, the main one has been like, social media client. But I feel like Nostr has a lot more use cases that, might be built out in the future rather than just another social media client.
I think so, yes. I've never really been a big consumer of the... So, I was maybe for a year a consumer of the social media, and I was a little more active. I was in the Nostr Riga conference 2 years ago in Riga for Nostr. I've kept tabs on it a little bit. I think now certainly the bigger interest is not in the social media platform. There are good things that are happening there, but it's just hard to move the conversation somewhere else, right? And it seems like it's not on Nostr. And I might be wrong. I think mostly what I mean by that is the conversation I'm interested in, they're not happening on Nostr. So this is one of the reasons why I don't use, I have Primal on my phone. I have my account and all of that stuff, but I rarely just visit. On the other hand, there's a totally different story where you use Nostr to be able to kind of like bootstrap this serverless type of infrastructure, or kind of like this, more distributed instance, perhaps with better censorship resistance properties than centrally hosted services. And I think that's massively important. We have it on our team. We have a lot of people that have even proposed protocols for Nostr very early on. They were builders on Nostr early on, and we still use it to this day, even on our on the back end of our Arcade.money app. Which, by the way, anyone that's interested in what we're building can go on Arcade. That's Arcade with a K, so ARKADE.money. But anyways, we use it on the back end for some key management stuff, and we were looking at ways to leverage it even for more ambitious projects where you have the ability now with Arcade to trade assets. Right, we have assets, we have Bitcoin. You have the ability to do swaps and eventually perhaps full on exchanges in a distributed way. And one of the interesting things is perhaps having an Nostr instance serve as kind of like a bulletin board, like an order book, basically, right, for different agents, perhaps different entities that are trading on Arcade. So I think that's perhaps promising. It's hard to say really if that ends up being the right solution, but I've always said with Nostr is that there is something to be said about very, very simple protocols, and I think that's always been one of the most heralded aspects of Nostr. So right now it's perhaps not getting all of the limelight. I expect there's going to be other use cases that show up where it kind of really, perhaps if it comes down to Nostr catching on, it'll be because of a different use case than the social media one. I'm just not sure which one that is at the moment.
Yeah, that's all very well said. While, to the listener, I might seem very critical of Nostr. I love using Nostr. I think it's magical to steal a meme on Twitter, post it on Nostr, and get zap sats. I mean, that really does feel awesome. But you're spot on. I don't think the social media clone is going to be the killer use case. I could see, as you mentioned, an order book. One of the things I always speculated is essentially almost like if you had software, and obviously AI is demonetizing the cost of software down towards near zero. But, if you wanted something built out, on Nostr, you can post a PR, and assuming someone fulfills it, you can zap them sats all through the protocol. And that opens up your workforce from no dealing with W-2s or 1099s or, health insurance for your employees. It's like, this is a PR. I don't care if a bot or a human or whoever, if this PR is completed to the standards that I want, I will pay you sats. And I think it opens up a global network. I think you could see a similar thing with order books, like you said. I think at this point it's too early, and, I think it needs to be, all that abstraction needs to be, kind of basically all that complexity needs to be taken away. But I could totally see whether it's a neighborhood or a Bitcoin group or something where it's like, you make your own server and you don't let anyone in except for people you approved. But I could see killer use cases like that, and whether you're posting bulletins or whatever, I think there are some very exciting things that'll get built out on Nostr. And I kind of like Nostr being weird and being like this niche little thing that I hang out in. But I do also hope it finds its killer use case, and it's going to be interesting to watch how that all shakes out.
Yeah, it has a lot of very interesting builders for sure. I mean, I was just thinking about this, but I feel like there is this compatibility between Bitcoin and Nostr, as is evident with zaps and all of that stuff, right? And I think there's potential where if something like what we're working on also catches on and becomes more popular, you do need some sort of, how I mentioned that Lightning has this network that connects. So Lightning is very much like the internet, like infrastructure level. It has an insane amount of architecture to communicate between all of these nodes. Arcade is more simple, but it doesn't have that, and it doesn't need that for a lot of what it does, but it might need like a communication layer to again coordinate. It doesn't need you don't need, you might have different servers, but it needs that communication to coordinate clients, right? to kind of allow them, perhaps, if you have a trading application, to create order books. So if you have systems more modern with Bitcoin, kind of what we're trying to do, which is this new generation really of Bitcoin application services and all of that stuff, my hope is that if we see this renewal of Bitcoin companies, this new era of new products and services, then I think they'll find a use case for Nostr. So perhaps the focus, or at least my focus, is on making sure that something that in the last couple of years has been very hard, which is building companies using Bitcoin technology, bring that in a new direction, a new level, and hopefully Nostr is a natural fit there.
Yeah, no, that's well said. And the only other question I have for you is, I like to ask this to everyone, well, Bitcoiners, I should say. If you could ask Satoshi one question, what would it be?
If I could ask Satoshi, yeah, I don't know. I'd ask probably where he stores his private keys.
That's actually one of my favorite answers. Only you and one other person have said that answer, and that would be nice. I would be on the beach, drinking Mai Tais, enjoying myself if I had those private keys.
Well, I mean, it's bless Satoshi, but really, I've been around. I've interacted with a lot of people that have been instrumental in building Bitcoin as it is today, and as much as all the credit goes to Satoshi for his original idea, I feel like one of the more unfortunate thing, again, in this industry is this notion that he should be heralded as some sort of saint or, it's a very religious classic reaction from people. Even we had one unfortunate instance again this week with the New York Times piece and Adam, and I've worked with Adam to the extent that I was we were renting I was working in San Francisco, and we were in the same apartment for a couple of weeks, and he was in and out obviously, but he's a great guy, very smart, has a lot of, very clever in his own ways, but I think fundamentally, a different mindset, I think, way of thinking than Satoshi. So I don't like. I feel like he deserves whatever he's got if he's still around. Otherwise, Bitcoin's moved on and it is much bigger than the man nowadays.
Yeah, well, that's well said, and it ties back into the point we made about these models. Google open sources their Gamma model. Immediately, someone jailbreaks it, and the model performs better. And to your point, it's amazing. Satoshi brought us sound money, but he open sourced the code, and because he did so, there were bug fixes, there were things that needed to be built on top of it, ways that needed to be improved, bips that made Bitcoin much easier to use for the layman. And if he didn't open source it, if he tried to keep it proprietary, there's no way that Iran is demanding Bitcoin to, pass through the Strait of Hormuz. There's no way that Michael Saylor builds Stretch and, builds one of the basically, largest balance sheet of Bitcoin in the world. There's no way all of these, things that ended up happen, El Salvador
Absolutely.
adopting Bitcoin. So it's because Satoshi open sourced it and gifted it to the world. That Bitcoin is what it is today, and I think that's a beautiful place to wrap it. Last thing I'll ask is for the audience, if someone is interested in Ark or following your work on social media, where can people find you?
Sure. Ark is probably best found at arklabs.xyz, arklabs.xyz, and then there's also a link to Arkade, our product, at arkadeos.com. I'm on X, mostly active at BERGE. That's BERGE Alex 4. And otherwise, yes, Ark Labs HQ is our handle.
Perfect. Well, I'll link to those in the show notes. And Alex, thank you again for coming on, man. It's been a pleasure. And to anyone who tuned in, thank you for listening to the Conor Shepnick podcast.
Started in the cycle. by block, truth between the lines. From the forms to the fire, from the cold to the crowd, but the world in the noise, shouting signal out loud. Signatures and conditions hidden in the chain. Every choice encoded, every loss in gain. Yeah. 10 minutes to forever or a moment off the grid. We find a way to move it with the asking who we are or what we did. You don't see the layers when the system feels right. Just a tap, just a scan, just a spark in the night. All the way to the network disappears in the flow. You don't need to know how, you just need it to go. We're dancing in the off-chain fire. No blocks, no walls, just something higher. From the mempool dreams to the lightning wire, we sign our truth, we never tire. No names, no gates, no kings, no liars. Just keys and code and silent choirs. If it breaks, we run to the chain. But until then, we ride the flame. Client calls the server, ask what is real. Trade a little trust for a smoother feel. We built the rails invisible, buried deep below, so the world can move like it always should've known. Batch it up, settle later, come press it all down. One footprint left in a crowded town. Every claim accounted, every pass secured. Not perfect, just better than the world we once endured. You don't think about channels or the scripts we write. Just a cue off, flicker in the go of your night. All abstraction rising like a tide we can't see. Till the system becomes what it was meant to be. We're dancing in the off-chain fire. No blocks, no walls, just something higher. From the mempool dreams to the lightning wire, we sign our truth, we never tire. No names, no gates, no kings, no liars. Just keys and code and silent choirs. If it breaks, we run to the chain. But until then, we ride the flame. There's no free lunch in a system of trust. Every shortcut bends, every layer adjusts. Finality waits in a block of time, but freedom lives in the space between the lines. Agents talking, machines that trade, still downstream of the choices we made. The fight was given, not chosen. Buy it, now build or burn, but don't forget. It's simple, take it higher. From stable ground to something wild. From first time user to sovereign child. They won't see layers, they won't care how. They'll just feel freedom. Here and now. Sign it once. Oh, hold your claim. Fails, you know the chain.